Hey folks, welcome to episode number 2 of GeoColors. Recently, well, more like a few months ago, nothing too exciting has been happening recently because of this whole freaking apocalypse. But a big topic of concern that we study about in schools and that the media doesn't get tired of talking about is rising sea levels caused by the melting of the polar ice caps. Unless you've been living under a rock at some point in time, you've heard someone talk about cities or countries being wiped out by rising sea levels. But no one really digs deep into what would actually happen if all the ice melted and if all seas rose. Sure, coastal cities and even whole islands would be wiped out, but so much more would happen that doesn't really get talked about as much. Like, I know rising coasts would destroy cities, but for some countries, rising sea levels could actually be quite advantageous. So I've done a lot of research, and I will in this episode try my best to educate you about what would actually happen if all the ice on Earth melted. Now say that you one day wake up to all of the ice on Earth melted. I'm talking about literally all of the ice on Earth, not only in Greenland and Antarctica, but also in permafrost, glaciers, and mountaintops. Now let's assume that somehow all of the ice made its way into the ocean. Well, if all the ice on Earth melts and it makes its way into the ocean, sea levels would rise by 66 meters, or for you Americans, Liberians, and Papua New Guineans who don't use the metric system, by 216 feet. Is that even how you say Papua New Guineans? Alright, I apologize. They're called Papuans. I'm sorry if I offended anyone. With seas rising, the first thing we need to worry about is relocating coastal line communities, especially ones located on low-lying islands. In the Pacific, Nauru would be wiped out considering that its highest elevation is just 26 meters above sea level. Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands would also be completely wiped out. Hey Thomas, can you stop screaming? I'm making a video! This means that for the people living on the islands, moving inland to survive isn't an option. They'll need to resettle in a completely different nation. I'm assuming that people living in Oceania would relocate in Australia, considering that Australia is like the economical backbone of the whole Pacific. Speaking of Australia, interestingly enough, if sea levels were to rise, a whole new lake would form within the country. I've taken a close look at the map of Australia, and the idea of a huge new lake forming in the country makes a lot of sense. If we take a close look, we could see that Spencer Gulf sort of punctures the nation, and further inland above the Gulf, we could see that there are multiple salt lakes. Eventually, water will seep in through the Gulf, bringing all the lakes together into one and consuming the land in between. The thing about this is, I don't think a whole new bay forming within Australia will affect the economy or even the citizens of the country, considering all major cities are along the eastern and western coasts of the nation. Also, for you animal wildlife peeps out there, I don't think the ecosystem will be that heavily affected, considering that the flood's gonna take place in the Artesian Basin, which is like all desert and salt. Koalas will be fine because they are found in the Great Dividing Range, which is in the far east of the country, which will not be eaten up at all by the ocean and is very far from the newly formed bay. However, it appears that the area that's going to be flooded is around the same area where kangaroos are most prominent, but that is not too concerning because they have a whole continent to roam around without being bothered, because a lot of Australians are white and white people treat animals better than they treat me! Other places on Earth that would significantly look different if all of the ice melted would be the US, China, and a large chunk of South America. In South America, all countries that lie along the Pacific coast will survive because that's where the Andes are located. Heck, even Peru's capital, Lima, although lying on the coast, will more than likely survive rising waters. I mean, just look at the city. It's as if the land knew what was coming for it and was like, psych, all you're having of me is that road, and guess what? I'll be cliff jumping every day. Damn it, Lima! What the hell? Nah, but seriously, I've been wanting to go to Lima for like ever, so if you want to donate me some money, I'll attach a link to my Insta in the outro. Although countries lying on the Pacific coast will survive, it looks like the ones lying on the Atlantic and the Caribbean coasts will not. The Guianas, which includes Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, most of you guys have probably never heard of these countries, but it's fine, that means you have a life. Anyways, all three of these countries will have their northern portions wiped out, which is quite unfortunate considering that's where most of the people live, and that's where the capitals of all three nations are located. I mean, if you look at a road map of Suriname and French Guiana, 0 roads lead to the forested southern regions, and no one lives there except for protected tribes who don't really enjoy contact with people to begin with, who don't really enjoy. So y'all need to get everything together unless you want to move down to Brazil. I personally would love to move down to Brazil. Have you ever had those moqueca dish? Damn, that got me feeling a bit hungry. Gummy bears. Anyhow, neighboring Venezuela to the west looks like it's gonna get hit just a little hard. The Orinoco River looks like it's gonna take all the overflow of water from its tributes to the east, forming a lake in the middle of the nation, effectively separating the north from the south. Now, will the people and the economy of the country be affected? Not really, considering that the capital, Caracas, lies to the north of where the lake is predicted to be located. That is not to say that the capital is guarded from the sea by the Venezuelan coastal range, also known as the Cordillera de la Costa. Also, I apologize if I offend anyone with my absurd Spanish accent. Honestly, way too many people think I'm Latino, and in my head I'm like, bro, have you ever heard of North Africa? Moving down to Brazil, it looks like the Amazon River will be heavily flooded. If all ice on Earth melted, I think that the South American ecosystem will be hit the hardest out of all ecosystems in the world, considering how important and critical the river is to 10% of the world's biodiversity. And considering that the Amazon is shrinking because of deforestation, in the case of rising sea levels, the Amazon forest might just be gone. The rest of Brazil appears to be okay in the case of rising sea levels, but although the Espinhaço Mountains protect the nation to the east, most of the big cities like Rio de Janeiro and Salvador lie between the mountains and the Atlantic, right on the shore. So unlike La Paz... Okay guys, so I meant to say Lima, not La Paz. La Paz is Bolivia's capital. I think energy was wearing off, so I was getting a bit tired. But anyways, I'm just dumb. So unlike La Paz, which lies on an incredibly elevated spot, these cities do not, meaning that they will unfortunately be gone. Now, I do think that the economy of the nation will be impacted just because 9% of the nation's GDP comes from materials like lumber and rubber, which all come from the Amazon. Also, many of the touristy big cities are going to be underwater, which will impact the tourist and finance industries. However, I do think that Brazil will bounce back, considering that their GDP is the 9th largest in the world, meaning that they would rebuild and organize everything strategically and effectively. So basically, their economy will be impacted just a bit, but they'll recover because they're rich. Also, many of the large cities like Sao Paulo are located away from the coast, and even their capital, Brasilia, is located deep within the country. The last place that I want to talk about in South America that looks like it's going to be hit is Argentina. I'm currently editing this video, and I made another mistake. I said that Montevideo was a city in Argentina, but it's actually Uruguay's capital. I can't really change much about it. I mean, I'm not a time traveler or anything too special. Argentina's economy looks like it's going to be impacted just because many of its big cities, including Buenos Aires and Montevideo, look like they'll be consumed by the ocean. Even Paraguay's capital, Asunción, although not lying anywhere near the coast, will also be underwater because the Parana River reaches all the way up to the capital, which is going to be the source of the newly formed bay. And Uruguay, on the other hand, will interestingly turn into a peninsula. And another new peninsula will form within the newly formed bay. This stuff is really confusing, but is honestly really wild. I spent way too much time talking about South America, so I'm gonna try to quickly but effectively talk about all the other continents. But before we move on, one more thing in South America that's worth mentioning is the fact that North America will still remain connected to South America. And that's thanks to two mountain ranges in Panama, the Serrania de Tabasara mountain range and the Serrania de Sapo mountain range. But honestly, that doesn't really change anything because we still can't travel from North to South America because of all the tribes that live in the area who refuse for any roads to be built on their native land. It's like, come on, man! Moving on to North America. Baja California will survive, which is quite surprising because it is a very long peninsula, but is not surprising because that's where the Sierra de Juarez mountain chain is. Basically, all of Mexico's Pacific coast will be intact because of the Sierra Madre Occidental and the Sierra Madre del Sur mountains. Quick Spanish lesson from the worst Spanish pronouncer: Sierra means mountains and Madre means mother, and that's sponsored by Duolingo. Much of the Yucatan Peninsula will be gone, and much of the land on the Gulf of Mexico will be gone too. I think that the tourism industry of the country will be affected just because a lot of foreigners visit the islands that lie off of the Yucatan Peninsula, like Cozumel, which will be wiped out. Cancun will also be wiped out as it's located on the northern tip of the peninsula. However, everything in Mexico will be fine because all of its big finance and commercial cities lie within the country, including the capital, Mexico City. America's economy will be hit hard because so many of its big cities lie on the east coast, which happens to be the area that's going to be hit the hardest. Rhode Island, Delaware, and Maryland will be completely gone. Big cities like Boston, New York, and even our capital, Washington, D.C. will be underwater. Florida will completely be consumed by the ocean, and so will the whole coast of Texas, which comes with no surprise. I mean, just look at its Gulf Coast. There's like a strange thin layer of land encompassed by water on both sides. I looked at this a few years ago on Google Earth and was really perplexed. I don't even think this geological feature has a name because I've done a lot of extensive research and couldn't find anything. So comment down below if you know what it's called. A whole new bay will form in the southern portion of the Mississippi River, which will consume most of Louisiana and Mississippi. What's gonna suck in the flooding of America is that the only place in the world where crocodiles and alligators coexist is in southern Florida, which is gonna be wiped out by the ocean. So say goodbye to that. The Great Lakes aren't gonna expand because St. Lawrence River, although connected to the ocean, flows north, draining all the waters of the Great Lakes into the Atlantic. So no water will be coming in from the ocean. On the west coast, nothing major is gonna happen because of the Rocky Mountains. However, because much of the surrounding San Francisco region is below sea level, and because there already is a huge lake connected to the Pacific, a thin bay will form, consuming much of San Francisco and the Central California region. Well, I spent way too much time on the Western Hemisphere, so I'm gonna try to zoom by Canada. Hudson Bay is gonna expand just a little bit, but that doesn't matter because no one really lives around that area anyways. The Arctic archipelago is gonna be fine, Quebec's gonna be fine, so let's move on to Asia. In China, Hangzhou Bay would expand into surrounding lakes, creating a large inland body of water and a large island inside of the newly formed large bay. In the Middle East, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would flood up, consuming all the land in between and expanding the Persian Gulf deep into Iraq, consuming its capital Baghdad, which is surprising because it's a good distance away from the Persian Gulf. The Black Sea and the Caspian Seas would expand even larger, connecting at the top of the Caucasus Mountains, separating Russia from Georgia and Azerbaijan. The Aral Sea and the surrounding lakes would also flood up, which might actually be quite economically advantageous for Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, because they've been complaining for a long time about how the Aral Sea, once fourth largest in the world, was drained and diverged by the Soviet Union. When we take a look at Europe, the first thing we realize is how eaten up by the ocean Denmark and the Netherlands are. This comes with no surprise considering that a huge portion of this area of the world lies below sea level. About a third of all of the Netherlands is below sea level, with the lowest being 22 feet. Here's an interesting fact for you. The Dutch have actually been building dikes since the 11th century, so they need to start focusing more on this than on the devil's herb. Africa looks like it would be the least impacted out of all the continents. Chott El Djerid and Doric Salt Lake in Tunisia will get flooded, as well as the Qatar Depression in Egypt and the Nafusha Plateau in Libya. I personally don't think much of North Africa will be affected, considering that a lot of the flooding is going to happen in uninhabited land, except for the northern regions of the Nile, or the southern since the water flows up to the Mediterranean. Anyways, I don't think many countries in Africa will suffer from a global flooding, if it would ever even happen, except for Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau, which look like they'd completely be submerged underwater. To wrap this video up, all that I just talked about will likely never happen, at least anytime soon. After all, we have enough ice on Earth right now to cover the whole entire continent of North America with a sheet of ice a mile thick. So the next time you hear about a record-breaking temperature sprawl, just know that it could be a lot worse. But scientists say that if we don't take immediate action to stop the Earth from warming up, matters will be irreversible. So yes, matters could certainly be a lot worse, and it will be if we're not careful. Thank you guys for tuning in. Stay productive, stay safe, and most importantly, keep wandering.